Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really powerful critique of how governments talk to us, specifically that growing gap between what's promised and what we actually see in our daily lives. We're going to look at two big examples that, according to some, reveal a strategy of focusing more on spin than on actual substance. We're in a crisis. That's how a recent political debate kicked off, and it really set the stage for a tough look at the Australian government's performance on two huge fronts: the cost of living, and, keeping kids safe online. The central argument was this: there's a massive disconnect between what the government is saying and what people are really experiencing. So first up, the big flashpoint. It's something pretty much everyone is feeling directly: the insane price of fuel. And look, we're not just talking about a small hike here. The commentators we're looking at framed this as a genuine crisis, one that's putting a ton of pressure on families and really the entire economy. I mean, to put a number on it, they pointed to the price of diesel hitting an incredible $3.25 a liter in some places. Now, a number like that doesn't just hurt when you're filling up your car. It sends a shockwave through absolutely everything. It drives up the cost of pretty much every single product you see on the shelves. And it wasn't just diesel either. When regular unleaded hit $3.05 a liter in regional towns, it just became impossible to ignore. For the critics, this wasn't just some random statistic. It was proof, undeniable proof, that the government's whole story of having things under control was just, falling apart. All this frustration led one commentator to use a really strong word: gaslighting. The question being, are Australians being gaslit? The argument is that when the government comes out with official statements, blaming things like panic buying or just offering these vague promises, it feels like they're trying to make people question their own reality, their own experience of pain at the pump. So what's the fix? Well, the most obvious one that comes up is to just cut the petrol tax, right? Give people some immediate relief. But as you can see here, that's a classic political trap. The second you decide to bring that tax back, no matter how much you need to, it just feels like a brand new price hike to everyone. And that's the government's dilemma. Do you offer that short-term help, knowing you're guaranteeing yourself some serious political pain down the road? Okay, so this whole theme of an ambitious policy running up against a messy reality, it isn't just about the economy. It's also happening in the social world, especially with the government's big plan to protect kids by banning social media for anyone under 16. The government itself called this world-leading reform. Now, the way they framed this is so important. They didn't just sell it as a good idea or a new rule. No, this was supposed to be a pioneering, globally significant policy. That's a very high bar they set for themselves. But here's the million-dollar question. Is this world-leading reform actually working? Well, the debate is split right down the middle. On one side, you have the critics saying it's a total failure in practice. Kids are just way too good at finding workarounds, and there's basically no real enforcement. But supporters argue that that's missing the point. They say it's a success because it gives parents a tool, it helps reduce peer pressure, and it sends a message to even younger kids that these platforms aren't for them. To defend the policy, one commentator had this really sharp analogy. They said, kids still underage drink. Do we think that alcohol policy is a complete failure? And that's a powerful point, right? The idea is we don't judge a law just based on whether everyone follows it 100% of the time. The law itself is important for setting a standard and changing how we think as a society. But here's where that analogy hits a snag. If a bar serves a minor, there are real consequences. Big fines, maybe even losing their license. So critics are asking, where are the penalties for the billion-dollar social media companies? Without any real consequences, they argue the ban isn't really a law at all. It's more like a strongly worded suggestion. So whether we are talking about what you pay at the pump or the rules for the internet, you start to see this pattern emerge, this big gap between the official policy and what's actually happening in the real world. And this is where the whole critique gets a lot broader. The commentators argued this gap isn't just an accident, it's a deliberate strategy. They basically called it an over-reliance on political spin, which is, the art of crafting a narrative that sounds good and wins people over, even if the results on the ground just aren't there. And that leads us to the final, and maybe the most serious charge of all. The argument here is that these aren't just a couple of struggling policies. Instead, they're evidence of a deliberate pattern of spin that really defines the government's whole way of doing things. So the idea is that the fuel crisis and the social media ban, they aren't one-offs. They actually fit into this broader pattern of really big announcements, promising everything from free doctor's visits to lower power bills that critics say just haven't materialized for the average person.
The promise is made very loudly, but the follow-through is very quiet.
And this quote, this just perfectly captures that final damning charge. The argument is that the government has become obsessed with winning the news cycle each day. It's about prioritizing that positive headline over the hard, often invisible work of actually making things happen. The announcement itself becomes the achievement, and the real-world results, well, that becomes an afterthought.
So ultimately, this whole critique kind of boils down to a really fundamental question, one that it forces us to ask. What actually defines an effective government? Is it the power of its big announcements and the skill of its spin? Or is it the quiet, difficult, and let's be honest, often unglamorous work of delivering real results? That's really the core question this whole debate leaves us cheering on.